So today's lesson we're going to be reading Act 1, Scene 2 of Romeo and Juliet, and I have here for reference your No Fear Shakespeare with the original and the modern and contemporary text. Remember that you can also reference the graphic novel and the Spanish version of this. So Act 1, Scene 2, we're going to specifically examine the figure of Capulet, or Juliet's father, and the role he plays as a landowning male within this text, who uses his daughter as a way to make peace within a war-torn area. So remember that Paris is the prince of the region, and he's made it quite swift and clear that anyone who should create violence in this situation will be banished or punished. So the scene begins with Capulet, Juliet's father, entering in with Paris, followed by Peter, his servant. So Capulet begins, "But Montague has sworn an oath just like I have, and he's under the same penalty. I don't think it will be hard for men as old as we are to keep the peace." "You both have honorable reputations," said Paris, "and it's too bad that you've been enemies for so long. But what do you say to my request?" Capulet responds, "I can only repeat what I've said before. My daughter is still very young. She's not even 14 years old. Let's wait at least 2 more summers, or 2 more years, before we start thinking that she's ready to get married." Paris believes that younger people than she is, younger people than Juliet, are happy to be mothers. Capulet responds, "And still they are too young, destroyed or marred by such early marriages. Girls who marry so young grow up too soon." And he says to Paris that he can go ahead and charm her, make her love you. My permission is only part of her decision. If she agrees to marry you, my blessing and fair words will confirm her choice. Tonight I'm having a feast that we've celebrated for many years, and I've invited many of my closest friends, and I'd like to welcome you and add you to the guest list. At my humble house tonight, you can expect to see dazzling stars that will walk on the ground and light the sky from below. So in this case, Capulet is saying that Juliet has a choice in the matter. And I would like you to question, to what extent does she actually have the choice that her father is claiming she has? Because this will become an important part later on in the play. Capulet continues, "You'll be delighted by young women who are fresh as spring flowers. Look at anyone you like and choose whatever woman seems best to you. Once you see a lot of girls, you might not think that my daughter is the best anymore. Come along with me." So while he's claiming that his daughter is too young to be married, he is also putting women in an object or a position of objectification, or a place where they are things for male consumption or for males to choose upon. To his servant Peter, he hands him a paper and says, "Go, little fellow, walk around Verona, find the people on this list and tell them that they're welcome to my house tonight." Capulet, or Juliet's father, and Paris, the prince, exit. Peter says to himself, "Find the people whose names are on this list? It is written that shoemakers and tailors should play with each other's tools, and that fishermen should play with paints, and painters should play with fishing nets. But I've been sent to find the people whose names aren't written on this list, and I can't read. I'll never find them on my own. I've got to find somebody who knows how to read to help me. But here come some people, right in the nick of time." And this is when Peter, or Capulet's servant, runs into Benvolio and Romeo. Remember that Benvolio is Romeo's cousin. Benvolio says to Romeo, "Come on, you can put out one fire by starting another," meaning you can get over your heartbreak by starting a new romance. "A new pain will make the one you've had already seem less. And if you make yourself dizzy enough, you can cure yourself by spinning back around in the opposite direction. A new grief will put the old one back out of your mind, and making yourself lovesick again by staring at a new girl will end your old lovesickness." Romeo responds in like sort of a joke that a plantain leaf, or sort of like a banana leaf, is really good for like lovesickness, as if it were something to be cured with a plant. Benvolio says, "For what, Romeo?" And Romeo responds, "When you cut your shin." Romeo says, "I'm not crazy, but I'm tied up tighter than mental patients in straitjackets. And if I'm locked up in a prison and deprived of food, I feel whipped and tortured." And he's explaining all of this to respond to the way that love has made him feel. Peter approaches the pair, and he says, "May God give you a good evening. Excuse me, sir. Do you know how to read?" Romeo responds that he can read his own misery, so he's responding again in relation to the heartbreak he's endured by being rejected by Rosaline. "Perhaps you've learned from life and not from books," says Peter, "but please tell me, can you read anything you see?" Meaning, can you read words? And then Romeo responds that yes, he knows how to read. Peter responds, "Thank you, that was an honest answer." And he says, "Have a nice evening, a nice day." And Romeo says that he can read the letter for Peter. He looks at the invitation and reads it out loud. And then Romeo says, is asking basically where this invitation is to, and where it is and for what purpose. Romeo asks whose house the party is at, and Peter responds it is at his master's house, or at Capulet's house. And then Peter, after listening to Romeo explain that he would like to be to this party, says, "Now I'll tell you so you don't have to ask. My master is the great and rich Capulet, and if you don't belong to the house of Montague, please come and drink a cup of wine. Have a nice day." So this is a situation that we like to call dramatic irony. And dramatic irony means that the audience, or us, listening or reading, we understand something about the characters in the scene that the characters themselves don't understand. So in this case, we know that Romeo belongs to the house of Montague, so he should not come because there's a feud or a fight or a conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets. However, Peter, who not only cannot read, but who cannot read clearly figures or personalities, does not know that Romeo is a Montague. So Romeo has the advantage of being able to fool someone in this scene that we know the actual situation about. Benvolio then enters the scene as Peter exits and says, "The beautiful Rosaline, with whom you love so much, will be at Capulet's traditional feast, along with every beautiful woman in Verona. Go there and compare her to some of the other girls I'll show you. And the woman you think is as beautiful as a swan is going to look as ugly as a crow to you." So in this situation, Benvolio is looking very much like a mirror image of Juliet's father, Capulet, in that he is comparing one woman to many in order for the object of affection, this time Rosalind, to be considered ugly by comparison or a less worthy object. Romeo says, "If my eyes never lie to me like that, let my tears turn to flames and burn them for being such obvious liars. A woman more beautiful than the one I love, the sun itself has never seen anyone as beautiful since the world began." And remember that last class we were speaking about the dramatic tone that Romeo takes and how he vacillates or oscillates or changes between these two extremes of hatred and depression and abjection and love and gentleness and compassion. And then as we end the scene, Benvolio urges Romeo to go to the party, says, "Come on, you decided she was beautiful when no one else was around. There was no one to compare her with except for herself. But let your eyes compare her to another beautiful woman, and I'll show you the feast. You won't think she's the best anymore." Romeo consents. He says, "I'll go with you, but not because I think you'll show me anything better, but so that he can see Rosalind one more time, so he can see the woman he loves." And they exit. So now as we go on to today's lesson, You'll see that our lesson objectives are to understand sexism, evaluate the treatment of men and women in modern media, and to consider how women were treated in Elizabethan England using drama specifically to consolidate or understanding. So I want you to think, how do you think the life of someone like Juliet or Rosalind was different than a person living in Santa Maria today? So how do you think the life of an Elizabethan woman might be different than the life of a woman living today? And understand that this could be, a lot of factors could go into this, right? We can think about race, we can think about class, we can actually think about gender orientation, we can think about education level. So what could a, let's say, white woman like Juliet of an upper class background be similar or different to one of our lives today? After you finish answering that starter in your Canvas assignment, I want you to discuss in a breakout room these various elements. So are these statements true or false? And I'm going to give you a few moments to consider these on your own, and then we'll come back and visit them. So true or false? Only sons could inherit their father's property and title, excluding monarchs. So with the exception of, let's say, a queen. 2, single women were suspected to be witches. 3, women were financially independent. It was acceptable to have premarital sex. Premarital sex brought shame on the family. Women could go to university. A proper education consisted of domestic duties or household assignments. With parental permission, it was legal for girls as young as 12 to marry. It was a sin to disobey a male member of the family. Women and men were believed to be equal. Women had little rights in choosing their husbands. So take a minute and think about those statements. And we'll come back to this slide in just a few moments. While we wait on that, let's think about what these particular critics or scholars tell us about Shakespeare and gender, and how that can relate to predictions we can make specifically about this play. So, one critic writes, men from opposite sides are meant to be defeated through fighting duels, and women are objects to conquer and overpower, or to satiate or satisfy sexual desires. Primal or animal-like nature and instinct tend to be initiated or started without second thought of morality and consequence. Anything less than boldness, anything less than aggression is not considered to be male. And the scholar Sapson challenges, draw a few be men, feeding upon societal standards and teasing his opponent with the idea that he is less of a man if he does not respond and fight. And there isn't any room for ruminations of love or emotional introspection. So in this case, with the exception of Romeo, who you've seen is really comfortable with expressing his emotions in these very dramatic ways, most of the men in this play are aggressive and only exist in this opposite realm of fighters where they're mirror images of each other. And if you're reading both the No Fear Shakespeare and the original text, you'll see that there's a lot of comparisons as well between the swords in the play and phallic references or references to the men's sexual organs. So you'll see that men are associated with this quality of fighting with their phalluses, and women in this case are objects to be conquered or overpowered. So much like we saw in the reading, women are traded versus men who are doing the trading, whether it's through violence or through negotiations. They don't really talk about their emotions. Another scholar writes that sexuality and gender are prominent themes in Shakespeare's plays. Depending upon the genre of the play, sexuality and gender are used either as a tool of manipulation, a form of propaganda, meaning persuasion, or sometimes both. During the time of Shakespeare, there was a social construct of gender and sexuality, just as there is today. And by blurring the lines between sexuality and gender in his plays, Shakespeare deconstructs these norms to display their ambiguity. Masculine men can play effeminate women roles on stage, and effeminate women can play masculine male roles. So this other scholar is saying instead that sexuality and gender are prominent, but they're things that can be manipulated or played with. So if you think about when we go back to our very first lecture on who Shakespeare was as a person, we're learning about like the stage craft and how plays were actually produced for live audiences. And because women were not allowed to play on the stage, many female roles or all female roles were played by men in drag or wearing women's clothes. And sometimes men who had not yet reached puberty, and so who in some ways exhibited more feminine traits by way of their voice register or quality or the shape of their body or the smoothness of their face. So this scholar is saying instead that like while these opposites of like male aggression and female compassion exist, the actual art of being on stage blends the two together and so actually plays with gender a little bit more. So we have these two perspectives. One is that men are aggressive, women are objects that are to be sexually desired and traded. And this other that is saying that gender is more something we can play with. But as we go back to these true or false statements, I'll give you some of the answers. So only sons would inherit their father's property and title, excluding monarchs. This is absolutely true. Women could not gain access to property, to the title of their land or wealth. In the case of their parents dying or some sort of estrangement. So the only way for a woman to gain property and title would be to become married and to live in her husband's home. Number 2, single women were suspected to be witches. This is also absolutely true. So women who were not married for whatever reason, sometimes because they came from lower class families and couldn't marry up, they were considered to be witches. And because they were often homeless and lived on the street and had to make money through other means, they were ostracized or kept out of mainstream society. Women were financially independent. That is false. So just as we saw in the first statement, women did not have access to property, to education, or to titles on their own. They could only do so through their husbands or their fathers. It was acceptable to have premarital sex. This is absolutely false. So the only sort of asset or capital or fund that a woman had at this time was her virginity. So a woman who had had premarital sex was considered not as valuable and therefore not as tradable as a woman who was a virgin. Premarital sex brought shame on the family. Absolutely true. So because of the mix of religion with the values and like the pride of fathers holding this possession of their daughters as virgins to be traded, premarital sex brought shame on the family. It was also considered a sin. Women could not go to university. In fact, few people could in general, but women specifically did not have any objective to gain an education. There was no point because they couldn't hold any type of job. A woman's proper education consisted mainly of domestic duties, and this is true. So it would be child rearing or keeping a home. With parental permission, it was legal for girls as young as 12 to marry. And that with parental permission just basically means if a parent wanted. And so that is true. Women as young as 12 could be married, and sometimes often younger. It was a sin to disobey a male member of the family. This is true. And this relates to the structure of the church in England at the time. So, like a male member of a family, specifically a father, was considered a godlike figure in his home, and an extension of God, as a male figure in the church and over England. And so to disobey a male member of the family who was considered an extension of God was to also sin against God. Women and men were believed to be equal. This is false, as we've seen. And women had little rights in choosing their husbands. So how would you summarize the treatment of Elizabethan women? I want you to think that you're a man or a woman in Elizabethan England, and a photographer takes your photo. Maybe it looks like either of these two images. This is an image of what, let's say, a woman would be doing at the time, and what's something that a man might be doing at the time. And I want you to think about how this might compare to what you see in your community today, and what has changed or not changed since this time. And then I want you to also create a frozen image that you think sums up the treatment of men and women in Elizabethan England. So based upon our true and false, based upon the reading, as well as the perspectives of those two scholars or academics, what predictions do you think we can specifically make about Juliet's father, Capulet, as regards this cult of masculinity, or like where he falls into this structure that we've been discussing? And this is the original Elizabethan English of the text that we've just read. And I want to break it down yet again. So Capulet says, but Montague is bound as well as I, in penalty alike, and 'tis not hard, I think, for men as old as us to keep the peace. So basically, Capulet is saying Montague and I are both old. We're not really going to fight anymore. It's past our time. Paris says that it's a pity that they've lived so long in this fighting state, but then wants to move on to the topic about marrying Juliet. Capulet says his daughter is too young. She's not even 14 years old, and he would rather her be 15 before she be considered ripe enough to be a bride. Ripe also meaning fertile to bear children. Capulet qualifies men as lusty, or driven by sexual desire, and women are fresh female buds. They're meant to be picked, and to flower, and that's also a sexual innuendo. So I want you to think, is Capulet a stereotypical Elizabethan father? Be prepared to back up your ideas. And now I want you to reference this definition. So, patriarchy is a social system in which males, biological males, are the primary authority figures central to social organization. They can occupy roles of political leadership, moral authority, or qualities on values and how people live their lives, control of property or land, and fathers hold authority over women and children. It implies the institution of male rule, so meaning men who have power, politically, economically, and socially, as well as privilege. So maybe it's not outright stated, but it exists by way of consequence, and entail female subordination. So It could be direct, like women are not given the same rights or access. It could also be subliminal. So looking at this definition, would you consider Capulet to be a patriarchal father? Is he a patriarch? And then be ready to justify your response. So in Canvas, you'll see that your assignment is as follows. So you're going to be writing a circa paragraph in which you give your perspective on whether or not Capulet falls into the definition of a patriarch in a patriarchal society. And so you'll go to Act 1, Scene 2, questions. You'll select this, and then you'll use these sentence frames to write at least 6 sentences for your circa paragraph answering this question.